I was driving alone down a long, barren highway when I first felt the prickling on the back of my neck, the sense that something wasn't right. I remember that night vividly, as if every moment were etched into my mind. The road stretched endlessly ahead, lit only by the weak beams of my headlights, and the dense darkness surrounding me seemed to swallow every comforting sound of civilization. I was headed to a small town for a friend's party, but fate had other plans. I started talking to myself, trying to calm my nerves. "It's just the isolation playing tricks on your mind," I muttered. But deep down, I knew there was something more sinister lurking out there. I had heard whispers of a cursed stretch of road known to locals as the middle of nowhere, where inexplicable happenings and eerie encounters were reported. At that moment, the car radio, which had been playing soft rock, suddenly cut to static before a deep, distorted voice whispered a single word: "Help!" My heart pounded so fiercely that I could barely breathe. I slammed on the brakes and looked around, but there was nothing, only the endless black void outside my window. Reluctantly, I resumed driving, but the radio remained silent. Every turn of the wheel filled me with a growing dread. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a figure on the roadside. The person appeared to be stumbling, and the flickering streetlight revealed a man in ragged clothes. Instinctively, I slowed down, my curiosity battling my fear. I rolled down the window and asked, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The man didn't answer. Instead, his eyes met mine with a haunted, pleading gaze before he melted into the shadows as if he were nothing more than a specter. I tried to shake off the encounter, blaming it on the eerie quiet and my overactive imagination. As I continued along the deserted highway, the landscape began to change. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snag the passing headlights. I noticed an abandoned farmhouse off to the side, a relic that time had forgotten. My instincts told me to avoid it, yet something compelled me to take a detour and investigate. I pulled over, and the gravel crunched under my tires as I stepped out into the cool night air. The farmhouse stood silently, its windows dark and empty, but the aura of despair was palpable. I knocked on the creaking door, half expecting someone to answer, but I was met only with silence and the sound of my own heartbeat. With nothing else to do, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was cloaked in shadows, lit only by the weak light of the moon filtering through broken windows. I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, as if every whisper of the wind through the crevices was a long-forgotten secret begging to be revealed. I walked cautiously, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. Suddenly, a faint cry echoed from the upper floor. "Hello? Is anyone here?" I called out, my voice trembling. The cry turned into a soft moan before fading away, leaving me in a deeper silence than before. Climbing the creaky stairs, I felt as if I were trespassing in someone's darkest memories. At the top, I found a narrow corridor lined with old portraits. Their eyes seemed to follow me, filled with sorrow and warning. One of the portraits, that of a young woman with a sad, knowing gaze, caught my attention. I felt an inexplicable pull toward her, as if she wanted me to understand her suffering. I continued down the corridor until I reached a small, locked room. I hesitated before forcing the door open, unsure if what lay inside would shatter the fragile line between reality and nightmare. Inside, scattered across the floor, were remnants of a lifelong past, faded photographs, tattered letters, and a diary. I sat on a dusty chair and began to read, the words spilling out in a frantic script that chronicled pain, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of doom. The diary belonged to the young woman in the portrait, who spoke of a family curse and a malevolent presence that had haunted their home for generations. At that moment, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I saw my breath. A low whisper filled the air, echoing through the empty space. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, every instinct urging me to flee. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the room for any sign of movement. Shadows danced on the walls, forming shapes that resembled twisted figures of the past. I felt as though I was being watched by unseen eyes, and every second stretched into an eternity of fear. I bolted from the room and raced down the stairs, the echo of my footsteps blending with the whispers that grew louder with each step. Outside, the farmhouse loomed ominously against the starless sky, and I didn't dare to look back. I jumped into my car and sped away. the eerie silence of that forsaken place forever etched in my memory. Even now, as I recount this harrowing experience, I feel that same inexplicable chill. It's as if the darkness of that night has followed me, lingering in the corners of my vision and haunting my dreams. I often lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the echoes of that whispered warning and the sorrowful eyes of that young woman. Every sound in the night becomes a potential harbinger of that forgotten horror, and every shadow hides the possibility of an encounter with that relentless despair. In the aftermath, I sought solace in the rationality of modern life, trying to explain the inexplicable. Yet, no matter how many hours I spend in the safety of daylight, the memory of that forsaken farmhouse and the curse it carried refuses to fade. I have shared this tale with a few close friends, warning them of the hidden terrors that can lie in wait in the most unexpected places. They listened, disbelief mingling with the chill of their own uncertainties. But those who have traveled that lonely road themselves, who have felt the icy grip of isolation in the dead of night, know that some horrors are all too real. Now, every time I pass that stretch of road, even during daylight, I feel a shudder of apprehension. It's a constant reminder that sometimes when you find yourself in the middle of nowhere, the darkness is not just the absence of light, but the presence of something far more sinister. My story may sound like a figment of an overactive imagination, but I assure you, it was all too real. The terror, the loneliness, the voices of the past, they are imprinted on my soul, a permanent scar from a night when the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred into one horrifying reality. I share my experience in the hope that you will heed the warning in the silence of the night. Should you ever find yourself driving alone on an empty road where the only light comes from a flickering street lamp and the shadows stretch endlessly, remember that sometimes help may come from beyond, and sometimes it comes at a price you're not prepared to pay. The memory of that night is a reminder that some journeys lead us to places where the veil between this world and the next is perilously thin. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I still remember that fateful winter night as though it were yesterday. My name is Marisol, and I never expected that a simple detour into the remote backroads of Montana would forever alter my life, forever binding me to the restless spirits of a forsaken place. It began innocuously enough when I decided to escape the relentless busyness of city life and take a solitary road trip into the wilderness. I had always been drawn to the quiet solitude of nature, but nothing in my years of travel could have prepared me for what awaited me in the middle of nowhere. My journey led me along a winding highway enveloped in a thick blanket of snow, where the only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of tires on icy gravel and the whisper of the wind dancing through barren pines. As dusk descended rapidly, I came across an old sign pointing to an unmarked location simply known as Whispering Pines. The name tugged at my curiosity. It wasn't on any modern map, but the fading letters on the rusted metal seemed to promise that hidden stories lay just beyond the next bend. Drawn by an inexplicable pull, I took the exit, driving along a narrow, winding road that disappeared into a bleak, snow-covered forest. In the distance, I glimpsed a structure through the swirling flakes, a once grand resort now crumbling and swallowed by nature. I recalled local lore hinting at its dark past, a time when it served as a luxurious retreat for the elite until an unexplainable tragedy left the halls echoing with sorrow and unquiet ghosts. Though the stories had always seemed like nothing more than tall tales, I sensed that I was about to learn just how real they could be. I parked my car under the skeletal branches of a large pine and stepped out. The cold bit at my skin, and every breath I took condensed into tiny clouds before disappearing into the night. The resort loomed before me like a decaying monument to forgotten grandeur. The once beautiful facade was marred by broken windows and vines that clung like desperate memories. With hesitant steps, I approached the main entrance, a pair of heavy wooden doors that creaked open as if inviting me into a world that time had abandoned. Inside, the lobby was draped in shadows. My flashlight beam danced across faded murals and dusty chandeliers, each relic a silent witness to moments of past splendor and hidden despair. I could almost hear soft strains of a piano playing in the background, an echo of a long-lost ballad of joy and sorrow. Yet the silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. I decided to explore further, determined to uncover the story behind the haunted resort. As I made my way through narrow corridors and desolate halls, I noticed that the temperature seemed to drop in discrete, inexplicable pockets. At one point, I passed by a grand ballroom where a thin layer of frost covered the cracked marble floors. There, suspended in the center of the room, was a single antique chandelier, its crystals glimmering like teardrops under the weak light of my torch. I thought I saw a fleeting movement, a blur of motion in one of the mirrors along the wall. For a split second, I caught sight of a pale, sorrowful face, eyes wide with a silent plea that made my heart thunder in my chest. When I blinked, it was gone, leaving nothing but the mirror's cold reflection and a lingering sense of profound grief. The hours slipped by as I roamed the deserted estate, piecing together snippets of its tragic history from scattered diaries and yellowed photographs. I learned about the family who once lived there, a family torn apart by a calamity so deep that the very walls seemed to absorb their pain. The diaries described ghostly figures wandering the halls, reliving their final moments in a tragic loop. It wasn't until I reached a secluded suite high above the lobby that I fully understood the terror of this place. The suite had once been the private quarters of a renowned violinist, a soul whose music had enchanted even the most stoic hearts. I sat on an old, threadbare sofa, trying to steady my trembling hands as I opened a diary bound in cracked leather. The entries spoke of a night when the lover of the violinist had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind nothing but a lingering presence and a heartbroken refrain echoing through the corridors. As I read, I became aware of a soft tapping on the window. Startled, I peered outside to see nothing but the relentless swirl of the winter storm. Yet inside my mind, a distinct melody began to play. A melancholic violin solo that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the suite. The room felt charged with an energy both mournful and malevolent. I felt an almost irresistible urge to follow the sound, as if it were a siren guiding me towards a destiny I could not escape. I rose from the chair, my pulse racing in sync with the eerie music, and ventured out into the corridor. Every step was accompanied by the creaks of the old floorboards, and every shadow seemed to stretch out like a skeletal hand reaching for me. The sound of the violin grew louder as I approached a narrow flight of stairs leading down to the basement, a place that, according to the diaries, once served as a sanctuary for the family in times of distress. The basement was a world unto itself, lit by a faint, unearthly glow emanating from walls lined with ancient portraits. Each face stared blankly from its frame, their eyes heavy with secrets and unspeakable loss. I slowly navigated through the maze of relics until I arrived at a secluded chamber at the end of the hallway. There, in the center of the room, lay a grand piano, its keys dust-covered yet unmistakably ornate. The music, smooth, sorrowful, and impossibly heart-wrenching, seemed to come from this very instrument, played by unseen hands with exquisite precision. As I stood, transfixed by the haunting harmony, a spectral figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man in a worn tuxedo, his face gaunt and his eyes filled with desperate longing. He moved with a grace that belied his apparent sorrow, and as our eyes met, I felt as if he were pleading for me to understand his story. In a voice like a whisper carried on a winter breeze, he spoke of a love lost and of a curse that had chained him to the resort long ago. His words were fragmented, laced with a deep sorrow that reverberated through the room. I listened, though every fiber of my being urged me to flee from this apparition whose fate was entwined with the haunted halls. Before I could respond, the floor trembled as if in the throes of an unseen quake, and a surge of emotion overwhelmed me, a collision of regret, pain, and a fleeting hope for redemption. The spectral violinist and I exchanged one last lingering look of mutual understanding before he faded into the darkness, leaving only the mournful strains of his phantom melody behind. Dawn eventually crept over the horizon, its pale light illuminating the remnants of a bygone era and dispelling the lingering shadows, if only temporarily. With trembling determination, I retraced my steps back to the entrance of the resort, each step heavy with the weight of everything I had witnessed. As I stepped out into the crisp morning air, I felt the oppressive presence slowly recede, but the memories of that night clung to me like a second skin. The drive back on the lonely highway felt surreal, the silence punctuated only by the distant echoes of that sorrowful song. I carried with me not just the terror of a haunted night, but the bittersweet legacy of lost souls and unfulfilled dreams. The experience taught me that some places are repositories of memories too potent to let go, locations where time stands still and the echoes of the past continue to live on in ghostly whispers. Now, as I recount the events with trembling voice and a heart still heavy with lingering grief, I understand that the wilderness holds secrets that no rational mind can truly grasp. In the vast middle of nowhere, I encountered a sorrowful spirit who had once been consumed by love and loss, trapped in an endless symphony of regret. I share my tale not as a work of fiction, but as a solemn reminder of the thin line between this world and the next, a line that can vanish in an instant when you least expect it. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I never imagined that a seemingly insignificant detour could alter the course of my life so profoundly. It happened during a long-awaited break from my hectic schedule when I decided to take a night drive through rural backroads, roads that few dared to travel after sunset. I was a cautious soul by nature, yet the lure of the unknown had led me far from the familiar highways into a realm where the past still whispered its secrets. I had been heading home after a business conference when my car's engine began to sputter, and soon enough, it shuddered to a reluctant stop on a lonely stretch of road. Surrounding me was nothing but the thick embrace of nature. A wild tangle of overgrown hedges, barren fields, and a canopy of ancient trees that blocked much of the starlight. In the distance, a dilapidated roadside motel emerged like a mirage in the pitch-black night. Its neon sign, once proud and welcoming, flickered erratically as if struggling against its inevitable decay. With no other choice, I trudged towards the motel for help. I pushed open the squealing, rusted door and was greeted by an interior that looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Faded wallpaper clung to cracked walls, and a layer of dust blanketed furniture that once must have been cherished. In the reception area, a cold gust of wind swept across the floor, as though the motel itself exhaled a chilling warning. I set up a small, makeshift camp in one of the vacant rooms, lighting a candle for comfort. As I sat listening to the silence, an unsettling sensation crept over me. I could almost swear that the shadows in the room seemed to shift on their own accord. At first, I convinced myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on my eyes. Yet, as the clock ticked past midnight, strange murmurs began to rise from the corners of the room. Unable to ignore the disquieting sounds any longer, I got up to investigate. The hallway was dimly lit by the wavering glow of a single street lamp that barely pierced the motel's gloom. I followed the faint, sorrowful hum that seemed to emanate from behind an old door marked maintenance. Steeling my nerves, I hesitated before turning the knob, only to discover nothing but an empty corridor lined with dusty doors. However, as I walked down the hall, the temperature dropped noticeably and an inexplicable feeling of dread took hold of me. Then I encountered a door slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, I was met with a room that appeared to have once been a storage space. Amid rusty tools and cobwebbed crates, I noticed an old, stained photograph pinned to the wall. It depicted a group of people, families, men and women with warm smiles, standing in front of this very motel decades ago. Their eyes, however, held an unmistakable sadness. Beneath the picture was a handwritten note. "Don't leave or you'll join our fate." The message sent shivers down my spine, and the hairs on my arms bristled with a sense of foreboding. Unable to shake the feeling that I was being pulled deeper into a mystery far beyond my understanding, I returned to my room, determined to get some sleep. But the night was far from over. Barely had I settled on the creaking bed when I saw a shape at the window, a translucent figure of a young woman in a long, tattered dress, her eyes brimming with an indescribable sorrow. I froze as she silently beckoned me to follow her. Conflicted by a mixture of terror and empathy, I hesitated before deciding to follow. The apparition glided silently down the dark hallway, leading me out of the motel and towards an open door at the back. I stepped into what appeared to be an overgrown courtyard. In the pale glow of the moon, I saw several more figures materializing among the tall weeds, ghostly occupants of the motel, each with a story etched into their somber expressions. Their eyes, fixated on the horizon, seemed to be searching for something lost long ago. One spectral man, with a lined face and ragged clothes, approached me. In a voice both mournful and soft, he recounted the tale of how the motel was once a lively haven for weary travelers, until a tragic accident claimed the lives of many on the road one fateful night. The accident had been covered up, the truth obscured by local authorities desperate to protect their reputations. Instead of justice, the town had been enveloped in silence, and the souls of the victims had been condemned to wander these grounds for all eternity. The man's spectral hand reached out, and I felt a chill that went beyond physical cold, a deep sorrow that pierced my very soul. As his tale unfolded in whispers that resonated with the wind, other spirits joined in, each sharing fragments of their past. A woman in an old-fashioned gown recounted the loss of her husband, a victim of the ill-fated accident, and a little boy, his features ghostly and ethereal, spoke of the day his laughter was silenced forever. Their voices blended into a haunting symphony that was as heart-wrenching as it was terrifying. I stood there, transfixed by the tragic beauty of their memories, feeling both pity and horror. The ghosts were not malevolent, it seemed. They were simply prisoners of their unresolved sorrow, forever tethered to the place where time had forgotten them. They pleaded for understanding, and in that moment, I realized I was not alone in my own struggles. Each of us carried invisible scars, hidden truths, and stories lost to time. The night deepened, and the spirits began to fade one by one as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. I was left standing in the courtyard, surrounded by the lingering echoes of their whispered farewells. Despite the overwhelming sadness of their plight, a sense of peace began to settle over me. I knew that I had borne witness to something beyond the ordinary, a realm where the living and the dead converged in an eternal dance of remembrance. In the hours that followed, as I waited for the morning to claim the darkness completely, I found myself re-examining my own life. The encounter had stirred memories of loss and missed connections that I had buried deep within my heart. It felt as though the spirits were guiding me towards a reckoning, a call to remember those who had been silenced and to cherish the fleeting moments that make up our fragile existence. When the sun finally broke through the lingering fog, I slowly made my way back to my car, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on my mind. The motel, now a forlorn relic in the light of day, seemed to watch me go with mournful eyes. As I drove away, the haunting images of the spectral faces and their sorrowful expressions clung to me, whispering that their stories were far from over. In the end, my unexpected detour had transformed into an unforgettable journey, a brush with the past that left an indelible mark on my soul. I realized that sometimes the most profound encounters occur when we least expect them, in places where history and heartache converge, reminding us that the line between life and death is not always as clear as we might believe. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I was driving down a lonely, winding road when the true nightmare began, a nightmare that has haunted my every restless sleep since that night. I remember the moment vividly. The sky was an unyielding, murky gray, and the wind whispered warnings through the skeletal trees lining the barren road. I had been returning from a friend's remote cabin when my car sputtered into silence, abandoned on a stretch of asphalt that seemed to end in oblivion. I never believed in ghost stories until I experienced the haunting terror of that dark, isolated corner of nowhere. With no cell phone service and not a single soul in sight, I reluctantly set off on foot, the only light coming from the feeble beam of a flashlight and the faint glow of a crescent moon. My heart pounded, each beat echoing my growing sense of dread as I ventured into the unknown. Every rustle of leaves and every snap of a twig sounded like a deliberate whisper in the darkness, as if the very night intended to communicate its secrets only to me. I could almost hear the echo of hushed warnings from unseen voices in the wind. I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated farmhouse, a ghostly silhouette against the backdrop of a barren field. Its windows were dark, its door slightly ajar as if inviting me to seek shelter from the biting cold. I hesitated, but the bitter winds and the gnawing cold forced my hand. I had no choice but to step inside. The inside was cloaked in shadows, the only illumination coming from the weak glow of my flashlight dancing across peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. I whispered to myself, this must be just an abandoned structure. Yet deep down, I sensed that it was not merely abandoned. It carried with it the residue of a tortured past. Inside, I found scribbled notes and faded photographs strewn across a rickety table. The photographs depicted a family, their faces etched with fear and despair, taken long before my time. The notes mentioned strange occurrences, inexplicable sounds in the dead of night, objects moving on their own, and warnings of a presence that preyed upon the unsuspecting. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I read the words, my mind racing with the possibility that I was stepping into a story far darker than any mere tale for sleep. As the evening wore on, I felt as if the house itself was alive. Each creak of the floorboards and each gust of wind through broken windows seemed laden with intention. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, I began to see fleeting movements out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting across the wall, a figure standing at the threshold of vision. I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. The silence was pierced by soft, almost inaudible whispers, unintelligible, yet laden with sorrow and malice. I decided to call out, my voice trembling as I pleaded, "Hello, is anyone here?" There was no reply, only the echo of my own words bouncing back from distant, unseen corners of the room. But then a low moan emerged from the upstairs corridor, as if someone was calling out for help in a tone that mixed anguish with darkness. I ascended the creaking stairs, my every step heavy with foreboding. With each step, the pleas grew louder and more desperate, as though the very walls echoed the despair of years past. In the upper corridor, I discovered a small, dusty room with a single bed, its covers disheveled as if someone had just fled in terror. On a battered dresser lay a diary, its pages yellowed and filled with frantic scrawls. As I skimmed through the entries, I learned of a family tormented by an unknown force, a force that invaded their dreams, turning sleep into a waking hell. The words spoke of nights filled with unrelenting terror, where unseen entities whispered secrets and threats, leaving them paralyzed with fear. The diary ended abruptly, as if the author had been overwhelmed by the terror that ultimately consumed them. It was at that moment that I felt an overwhelming presence behind me. I spun around, and there, in the murky gloom, stood a gaunt figure with hollow eyes, its mouth contorted in a silent scream, an expression of agony and malice etched deep into its features. I wanted to run, but my legs betrayed me, rooted to the spot by an indescribable force. The figure leaned forward and whispered, so faintly I could hardly discern the words, "You will not sleep tonight." I felt my heart shatter with that promise, and my mind snapped into a state of terror-induced paralysis. The ensuing minutes felt like an eternity as the room transformed into a vortex of horrifying visions. Shadows coalesced into monstrous forms that swirled around me, their ethereal voices merging into a cacophony of despair. I was caught between waking and sleep, where reality blurred into a nightmarish landscape of phantoms and tortured memories. I begged silently for the nightmare to end, for the promise of dawn to break the monstrous spell that held me captive. In that room, the boundaries of time lost all meaning. I cannot recall how long the torment lasted. I remember only fragments, disembodied cries, fleeting glimpses of faces contorted in perpetual torment, and that relentless whisper that followed me into every waking moment. The force that had invaded that forsaken farmhouse was not confined to that single location. It was something malevolent that had latched onto me, destined to haunt my every attempt at rest. I eventually escaped the farmhouse, stumbling back into the night as if exorcising a demon that had attached itself to my soul. Even now, as I sit alone in my modest apartment, the memories persist. Every creak in my house, every shadow passing by the window, reignites the terror of that night. I have tried everything, changing my route, staying in well-lit areas, even sleeping with multiple lights on, but the haunting presence refuses to dissipate. The incident has changed me irrevocably. I no longer find solace in sleep. Instead, I dread the moment when my eyes close. In the quiet hours of the night, when everything should be at peace, the memories surge forward with the same relentless intensity. I have come to realize that sometimes the horrors that torment us are not the ones we create in our minds, but those that stalk us from the depths of the unknown. There is a chilling reality to the darkness that exists in the middle of nowhere. a malignant force that, once encountered, never truly leaves you. I share this story not as a work of fiction, but as a testament to the inexplicable horrors that can lurk just beyond the veil of ordinary life. My experience has taught me that there are places in this world where darkness reigns supreme, where the line between nightmare and reality is blurred, and where even the faintest glimmer of hope is consumed by the inexorable pull of dread. If you ever find yourself stranded in a remote part of the world, heed my words. Be cautious of the silence, for it might conceal the whispers of an unspeakable horror waiting to claim your sleep forever. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I'll never forget the night the road betrayed me. I was driving along a remote highway, cutting through an endless stretch of barren land, the kind of isolated highway that modern maps forget. I had been driving for hours, my destination a small outpost where I'd planned to rest before continuing on a long-awaited journey. As dusk turned the endless asphalt into a ribbon of gloom, my headlights revealed an unexpected sight. A narrow, unpaved trail veering off the highway like a secret invitation into the unknown. Despite the uneasy feeling tugging at me, I decided to follow the trail, hoping it might lead to a service station or a small town. Instead, it led me deep into a forgotten region, one that even the locals rarely mentioned. As I neared a bend, my car shuddered violently before sputtering to a halt. The engine died, leaving me stranded in silence, except for the pounding of my own heart and the whisper of the wind through scrubby brush. I stepped out into the cool night air, the chill seeping into my bones. The only guide was the weak beam of my flashlight, its light dancing erratically across the cracked earth and scraggly vegetation. I scanned my surroundings and discovered an old weather-beaten shed that stood like a relic from another time. Desperate for shelter and perhaps help, I approached cautiously, my every step weighted with apprehension. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and stale memories. The single room of the shed contained a few battered chairs, a rusted metal filing cabinet, and the remnants of what might once have been a stove. A faded calendar hung crookedly on the wall, its pages yellowed and brittle, marking dates long past. I tried to light a match, but it sputtered weakly, as if protesting against the darkness that seemed to infuse every corner of this lonely place. While rummaging through some old papers strewn across a dusty shelf, I found a diary tucked behind a stack of decaying magazines. The diary belonged to a man named Thomas who once lived in this now abandoned complex. His frantic, uneven scrawl described a series of events that made my skin crawl: the sudden appearance of a spectral figure on a long-forgotten trail, whispers in the dead silence of night, and a relentless feeling of being watched by something that was not alive. Thomas's final entries were frantic, speaking of a presence that had invaded not only the shed but his every thought. No sooner had I absorbed his words than a deep sound echoed from outside, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wooden door. My heart thundered in my chest as I tiptoed to the door and peered out. Under the ghostly light of a gibbous moon, I saw nothing but the deep dark of the surrounding wilderness. Yet the scraping persisted, rhythmic and insistent. I shut the door, and for a long moment, silence reclaimed the space, broken only by my shallow breathing. I tried to convince myself it was merely the wind, or perhaps a branch tapping against the wood, but a nagging feeling told me otherwise. I decided to wait out the night, lighting a small lantern from an old oil can I found. The lantern's flicker cast long, distorted shadows across the floor, making the shed seem like a stage for an unseen drama. As midnight approached, a soft, otherworldly murmur rose up from the silence outside. It was as if voices were reciting an unholy litany in a forgotten language, echoing from the depths of the night. A sudden crash from the far side of the shed startled me. With trembling hands, I unlatched the heavy door and slowly stepped out into the oppressive darkness. The full moon now hung high in the sky, its pale light illuminating a scene that defied explanation. In the distance, among a circle of gnarled cacti and wind-blown sand, stood a spectral figure, draped in tattered clothing. Its eyes, dark and unseeing, locked onto mine with an intensity that chilled me to the marrow. I couldn't tell if it was beckoning me forward or warning me away. Frozen by terror, I watched as the figure began to move with an unnatural glide, its feet never quite touching the ground. It seemed to be retracing steps I had unknowingly taken earlier on this trail, a path that Thomas had once documented in his diary. His notes spoke of an entity bound to this desolate land, cursed to wander the empty roads and abandoned shelters, feeding on the fear of those unfortunate enough to cross its path. I took a step back and then another, desperate to retreat back into the safety of the shed. But the figure was faster, its presence swelling until it seemed to envelop me entirely. In that moment, the whispers I had heard earlier crescendoed into a chorus of spectral voices, each one intoning my name. The air thickened, making it difficult to breathe. The temperature plummeted, and my lantern sputtered as if struggling against an unseen force. I could feel the weight of centuries of sorrow and anger bearing down on me, and my mind raced with the chilling realization that this wasn't a simple ghost. It was the embodiment of every tragedy that had ever occurred in this forsaken place. It was as though the land itself was alive with history, wounded by past misdeeds and painful losses. The figure's outstretched hand reached toward me, and for a split second I thought I saw in its face an expression of profound anguish, a silent plea for release from its eternal torment. With every ounce of courage I could muster, I ran. I sprinted through the barren landscape, my bare feet slapping against the hardened earth as I tried to escape the grasp of that relentless force. The night air was filled with a cacophony of disembodied cries and the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. I tripped, fell, and scrambled again, desperate to put distance between myself and the spectral pursuer. I eventually burst onto a narrow dirt road lit only by the faint glimmer of starlight. My lungs burned as I pushed myself further, not daring to look back. I don't know how long I ran, only that the relentless terror of that presence spurred me forward until, by some miracle of fate or chance, I stumbled upon a small, dimly lit gas station. The attendant, with eyes filled with quiet understanding, took in my battered appearance and listened as I recounted the horrors of the deserted trail and the haunted shed. They told me, in a hushed tone, that the location was known among locals as the Last Crossing, a place steeped in legends and tragedies, a crossroads of lost souls. The attendant's own eyes seemed to harbor memories of encounters with that ghostly figure, a silent testament to the dark history that clung to the land. Since that fateful night, sleep has evaded me like a distant dream. Every creak in my house, every sudden gust of wind, reminds me of the spectral touch that nearly claimed my soul. I still wonder if I merely encountered a tortured spirit, or if something far older and more malevolent had reached out to claim me as its own. The memory of that forlorn figure with its haunting, sorrowful eyes is etched into my mind, a reminder that some roads lead to destinations one should never seek. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I never imagined that a simple detour could forever change the quiet rhythm of my nights. It was late autumn when I decided to leave my bustling city behind for a much-needed escape in the remote corners of northern Montana. I was driving through a lonely stretch of road known only to a few locals, the kind of place where the sky unfolds in endless stars and the silence holds secrets you're never meant to uncover. That evening, my aging pickup rattled along an almost forgotten highway bordered by dense, whispering forests and vast, empty fields. I was headed toward an old homestead that my distant cousin had mentioned years ago, a place where one could find solitude for reflection and respite. With only a vague sense of direction and a heart open to escape the constant hum of city life, I turned off the main road and followed a narrow, winding lane that eventually gave way to a dirt track. Before long, I found myself facing a long-abandoned farmhouse, its faded paint barely clinging to the weathered wood, and its silhouette etched against a bruised purple dusk sky. There was an eerie allure to the building that made my skin crawl while also beckoning me with a strange promise of refuge. I hesitated, wondering if the place was truly abandoned or if it harbored some ghostly secret of its own. But exhaustion and the biting cold pushed me to explore the possibility of shelter. I pulled my truck into the overgrown yard and stepped out, the chill night air biting at my exposed skin. My footsteps crunched on the frost-hardened grass as I made my way cautiously toward the entrance. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, revealing a dust-thick foyer lit faintly by the glow of a dying lantern still hanging from the wall. The musty scent of decay and old memories filled the air. I couldn't help but shiver, not entirely from the cold. Inside, the house was a museum of forgotten lives. Faded photographs in cracked frames, tattered drapes, and scattered relics of a bygone era hinted at stories of sorrow and loss. As I moved deeper into the dim corridors, I felt both drawn in and repelled by the palpable heaviness that clung to every surface. There was something inexplicably off about the place, as if the lingering souls of its past still wandered its silent halls. I decided to make myself comfortable in what seemed to be a sitting area near a collapsed fireplace. I set up my makeshift bed on an old, threadbare rug and tried to warm up by lighting a few candles found in a dusty side cabinet. The soft flicker of the flames cast quivering shadows across the room, and for a moment, I felt a measure of safety amid the cold isolation. But as the night deepened, so did the strangeness of my surroundings. I awoke several times, every time to an unsettling sense that I was not alone. The silence, thick and oppressive, was shattered by distant murmurs and unexplained creaks that echoed through the empty halls. At first, I convinced myself that my imagination was playing tricks on me, a side effect of exhaustion and the eerie solitude of the place. Yet as the hours ticked by, the sensation of being observed grew stronger. I distinctly remember one occurrence that sent a jolt straight through my core. Just after midnight, as I lay trying to calm my racing heartbeat, the distinct sound of slow, measured footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. They were deliberate and heavy, as if each step carried with it the burden of untold sorrow. I clutched the blanket closer, persuading myself that it was merely the settling of the old house. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they halted right outside the door to the room where I was sleeping. Compelled by a mix of dread and a desperate need for understanding, I mustered the courage to open the door. The corridor beyond was shrouded in darkness, with only the faint flicker of my candlelight to guide my eyes along its uneven floor. I stepped out slowly, calling out softly into the void. "Hello?" My voice trembled in the oppressive silence. No answer came, only the sound of my own echo. I moved forward, drawn by a sudden intuition to follow the trail of footprints that meandered down the hall. They seemed to lead toward a narrow opening at the back of the house that I hadn't noticed before. A small, arched doorway that opened onto a deserted porch. As I reached the threshold, a gut-wrenching chill swept over me. The air beyond the door was unnaturally cold, and my breath turned to mist before disappearing into the night. There, leaning against the far wall of the porch, I saw a figure. It was a woman, draped in garments that belonged to another era, her eyes sunken with an ineffable grief. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the lantern's light, and a deep sorrow radiated from her presence. I couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. Instead, I simply stared as if my very presence could force her to dissolve back into the twilight. The ghostly woman lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine with a silent plea. Her gaze was filled with regret, as if she were burdened by untold stories of loss and betrayal. For a long moment, we simply regarded each other, two souls adrift in a tapestry of haunting memories. Then, with a sorrowful whisper that barely escaped her lips, she said, "Leave, before the night consumes you, as it consumed me." Before I could respond, she faded away like mist in the morning sun, leaving me shivering on the cold, hat-creaking porch. I felt a surge of desperate fear claw at my insides, urging me to run, to escape this house of mourning. I retraced my steps, heart pounding in terror as I hurried back through the dim corridors, away from the only sanctuary I'd trusted moments before. I barely made it back to my pickup truck when the first pale hints of dawn began to brighten the horizon. I sped away without ever once looking back, the images of that sorrowful apparition etched indelibly in my mind. I later learned from a local that the farmhouse had once belonged to a woman who lost her beloved to a tragic accident, and in her grief had taken her own life by jumping from the very porch where I had encountered her. The locals whispered that her restless spirit roamed the grounds, warning unwary travelers away from a fate that had left her trapped between worlds. Even in the daylight, I could hardly shake the overwhelming feeling of despair that encounter had seeded within me. I spent many sleepless nights recalling the expression on her face and the faint, desolate tone of her plea. At times, in the dead hours when the world fell silent, I swore I could hear her soft, mournful whisper echoing in the recesses of my mind, calling me back to that desolate porch. I now live with the burden of that chilling memory. My sleep is no longer a haven, but a battleground, where shadowy figures and silent voices intrude upon my dreams. I have learned to avoid lonesome roads and abandoned places, for in the quiet of isolation, one might encounter a sorrow so profound that it seeps into the very marrow of your soul. I share my tale not to frighten, but to warn anyone who might be tempted by the allure of forsaken places. A remote highway is not just a path through the darkness, but a gateway to secrets that yearn to be remembered, or perhaps to be avenged. And so, as I sit in the safety of a well-lit room, I cannot help but wonder if the ghostly figure still lingers in that forgotten homestead, forever bound by love and loss, her eternal lament, a warning to those who dare to seek refuge in the middle of nowhere. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustles the trees and the night draws near, I find myself listening for that familiar, sorrowful whisper, a reminder that some spirits never truly leave, and that the past is never as distant as we hope. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? Listening to the silence that blankets the vast, empty stretch of the desert was an experience I never imagined would lead to a nightmare. My name is Daniel, and I'm here to testify to a series of events that continue to haunt my sleep to this day. It all began on an innocuous autumn evening when I found myself driving along a desolate road, far removed from civilization in a place locals ominously referred to as the middle of nowhere. I had planned a short journey to a remote camping spot, seeking solitude and a break from the relentless pace of city life. As the fading twilight danced across the horizon and the world around me grew still, I had no inkling that I was about to step into a realm where fear and reality intertwined. As darkness fully swallowed the landscape, the familiar hum of my car engine suddenly felt oddly intrusive in the oppressive quiet. The radio, which had already been patchy with static, started emitting whispers that I initially dismissed as interference. But with each passing minute, the whispers transformed into distinct murmurs, echoing like forlorn echoes of lost souls. I rolled down the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of what might be causing the disturbance, only to be met by a chilling gust of frigid wind and an overwhelming sense of unease. The voice, barely audible at first, continued to recite fragmented phrases that sent shivers down my spine. In that moment, I realized I was not alone. Something unseen was watching, waiting, and it was as if the darkness itself had come alive. Desperate for answers, I turned off the highway and sought refuge at a weathered roadside diner that, according to my outdated map, had long been abandoned. The neon sign above the entrance flickered in erratic bursts, casting ominous shadows across the cracked pavement. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the heavy scent of old coffee mixed with rust. I approached the counter, my voice trembling as I asked the lone, gaunt attendant if he had seen any other travelers that night. His eyes, sunken and haunted, offered no comfort as he merely shook his head and muttered something about spirits that roamed these forgotten roads. I left the diner in a hurry, my heart pounding and my instincts screaming that I had unwittingly brushed against a supernatural force that defied all reason. Back on the road, the unsettling experience escalated. The car's interior grew colder by the minute, and I could feel an unseen presence growing closer with every mile. The whispers returned, now intermingled with soft, sorrowful wails that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath my tires. It was as if the desolation of the place had imbued the night with a palpable grief. My pulse raced, while thoughts of local legends, stories of wandering spirits, and ancient tragedies flashed through my mind. I recalled a conversation with an old truck driver who once warned me that these stretches of land were cursed, haunted by restless souls seeking redemption or revenge. I clutched the steering wheel tightly, unable to shake the feeling that I was being led into a trap set by forces far beyond human comprehension. I eventually came upon an old farmhouse, its silhouette stark against the starless sky. With nowhere else to turn and the chill of the night biting at my skin, I parked the car and stepped into what I hoped would be sanctuary. The farmhouse stood in eerie silence, its broken windows and creaking porch bearing witness to decades of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with decay, and every step I took echoed through the empty halls. I barricaded the door behind me, seeking to secure a fragile barrier between myself and the unseen horrors outside. Yet, despite my best efforts, the oppressive atmosphere within the farmhouse only amplified my growing terror. I could feel countless eyes watching from the shadows, and soft, indistinguishable murmurs floated through the rooms as though the building itself were alive with sorrow. Alone in that forsaken dwelling, time lost all meaning as I waited for the night to pass. I tried to find solace in rational explanations, convincing myself that fatigue and isolation were the culprits behind the haunting sensations. However, every creak of the wooden floor and each whisper of the wind only deepened my conviction that something malevolent was at work. In the dim glow from my dying phone, I scribbled frantic notes, determined to document every inexplicable occurrence. I recorded how objects inexplicably shifted, how the temperature plummeted without reason, and how I could sense the overwhelming sorrow of countless lost souls. Each passing minute stretched into an eternity as the darkness pulsed with an unspoken promise of doom. Even as the first light of dawn began to chase away the shadows, the memories of that terrible night remained indelibly etched in my soul. With hesitant steps, I emerged from the decrepit farmhouse, my body weak and my mind burdened by the weight of surreal terror. The silence that greeted me outside was heavy with unanswered questions, as though the very air was mourning the horrors of the previous hours. I drove away slowly, as if reluctant to leave the inexplicable darkness behind, my thoughts swirling with images of those ephemeral voices and unseen eyes. Though the daylight forced the apparitions to recede, the echo of their despair continued to resonate within me, a relentless reminder that some experiences cannot be undone by time or reason. I share my story not as fiction, but as a genuine account of a night when reality merged with unyielding terror. The middle of nowhere is not merely a place. It embodies isolation, where the living and the dead converge. The inexplicable events and sorrowful voices stand as proof that forces beyond understanding exist. To anyone venturing into remote stretches, heed my warning. Safety is an illusion in the darkness. I carry the memory with relentless fear. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? It was a night I'll never forget. A night when the veil between our world and something else grew impossibly thin. My name is Evelyn, and I still shudder at the recollection of that dreadful evening when I found myself stranded in the heart of nowhere, where time itself seemed to dissolve into an endless terror. I had set out on a solitary drive through the barren plains of New Mexico, craving a brief escape from the stifling pressures of everyday life. The desert was unyielding in its silence, its vast emptiness both eerie and oddly inviting. I had heard tales of a forgotten town, once a thriving railway stop, now reduced to crumbling remnants, and whispered legends of inexplicable happenings. Curiosity and a longing for solitude had compelled me to take a detour toward this long-abandoned relic. As twilight descended, the highway narrowed and twisted between towering rock formations and a scattering of scrub oak. The sun dipped low, its final rays casting deep, unsettling shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt. My headlights revealed an old, dilapidated sign, "Welcome to Rosedale." I'd never heard that name before, yet it beckoned me like a siren's call. I parked my car by the roadside, its engine purring low in the dry, dusty air, and stepped out to explore. The town itself was a ghostly echo of a bygone era. Weathered wooden buildings leaned precariously, their paint peeling away like memories lost in time. Windows were shattered or clouded by layers of grime, and wild ivy had claimed nearly every surface. I walked through the silent streets, my steps echoing on gravel and forgotten dreams. Every sound was amplified in the oppressive quiet. A creak here, a distant rustle there. I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were tracking my every move. In the center of Rosedale stood a solitary structure, an old visitor's motel, its neon sign flickering sporadically. Driven by both dread and fascination, I decided to seek shelter within its crumbling walls. The front door swung open with a ghostly groan, as if reluctant to admit a living soul. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with neglect. A faint odor of mildew mingled with something else, something not entirely human. I felt an inexplicable chill, even though the desert night was crisp and dry. I took a small room on the upper floor, its door creaking ominously as I shut it behind me. I rigged up a lamp on an antique bedside table and sank onto a moth-eaten armchair. No sooner had I settled than the room seemed to shift around me. Shadows clung to the corners of the ceiling, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure at the far end of the hall, a vague, indistinct silhouette that vanished when I blinked. That night, sleep refused to come. The oppressive silence was punctured by inexplicable sounds. Distant voices muttering in low, mournful tones, the soft scraping of unseen claws against wood, and a persistent, rhythmic tapping, as if someone were pacing back and forth just outside my door. I sat up and listened, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispers felt desperate, laden with sorrow and longing, as if the voices were reliving a forgotten tragedy. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to tell me something. At some point in the early hours of the morning, I was roused by a noise that felt too deliberate to be the wind, a slow, measured knocking at my door. I hesitated, then forced myself to stand and approach. With trembling fingers, I reached for the brass doorknob and slowly turned it. The door creaked open to reveal an empty corridor, dimly lit by a single flickering light. I stepped into the hall, and the knocking ceased abruptly. A sudden sense of dread suffused me as I realized the silence was even more terrifying than the sound had been. I began to pace through the motel, following the corridor as it twisted uncomfortably, leading me deeper into the dark bowels of the building. The walls were adorned with faded photographs and obituary notices, each one depicting faces frozen in time, people who, I presumed, had once called this place home. Their eyes seemed to follow my progress, filled with a haunting mix of sorrow and accusation. I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps it was just an old building playing tricks on me in the silence of the night. But deep down, I knew there was an unspeakable sorrow woven into every crevice of Rosedale. As I rounded a corner, I came upon a large, ornate door with peeling gold leaf that led to what appeared to be a parlor. Inside, the temperature plummeted instantly, as if I had stepped into a crypt. In the center of the room was a grand mirror, its glass mottled with age. I approached it hesitantly, only to catch my reflection morphing into something unrecognizable. A gaunt version of myself, eyes shadowed with despair, as if the mirror captured not who I was, but who I might become. And then, behind the glass, I saw fleeting images. A family gathered in sorrow, a funeral procession under a leaden sky, and finally a pair of pleading eyes that mirrored my own terror. The images vanished as quickly as they came, leaving me shaken and desperate for escape. I stumbled back into the corridor, searching for a way out, only to find that every exit seemed to lead back to the same oppressive labyrinth of halls and dark rooms. Panic began to seep in. I was caught in a cycle of endless corridors, each turn a mirror image of the last. My pulse pounded as the voices rose again, now overlapping with mournful cries and anguished sobs that reverberated through the walls. I could no longer discern time or space. It was as if Rosedale had become a living entity, intent on ensnaring me in its relentless despair. I found myself running through the narrow halls, pursued by invisible forces that whispered my name and urged me to remain. Just when I thought I could bear no more, I stumbled upon a narrow staircase leading down into what I hoped was the basement, a realm that might offer escape from the haunting maze above. The basement was even more claustrophobic than the rest of the motel. Flickering fluorescent lights barely illuminated rows of forgotten storage rooms, each filled with relics and remnants of lives long past. The air was thick with dust and something far more disturbing, an acrid, coppery scent that clung to everything like a curse. It was in one of these cramped rooms that I discovered a collection of journals and letters, dusty pages detailing the final days of Rosedale. The entries spoke of inexplicable vanishings, of restless spirits caught between worlds, and of a malevolent force that thrived on the sorrow and despair of those who dared to linger. Each word etched in those brittle pages resonated with the eerie experiences I had endured. The journal entries revealed that the motel once belonged to a family who suffered an unspeakable tragedy, lost in a terrible accident that left them adrift in a sea of grief. In their anguish, they had unwittingly invited a darkness into their lives, an entity that fed on despair and anchored itself to the building. Their attempts to leave had been thwarted, as if the motel itself would not let them escape. Now, it seemed, the same fate was befalling me. Horror gripped my heart as I sank to the cold, dusty floor, the journal clutched in my trembling hands. I felt the presence of those long-lost souls, their sorrows echoing in every crevice of the room. The oppressive energy in the basement seemed to whisper promises of eternal torment, and I knew I needed to find a way out before I too became a permanent resident of this forsaken place. Gathering the last of my courage, I left the basement and retraced my steps in hopes of finding an exit. I began to follow the sound of my own heartbeat, each thumping echo a desperate countdown to escape. In the distance, I saw a faint glow, perhaps the promise of dawn or a sign that I could leave this nightmare behind. With every ounce of strength, I pushed forward, navigating the twisting corridors and relinquishing the grip of the relentless despair that sought to keep me captive. Finally, as the first muted hues of sunrise began to seep into the sky, I burst out of the main entrance into the cool open air. The world outside seemed unchanged, yet I felt irrevocably different, as if I had glimpsed a realm beyond mortal understanding and lived to tell the tale. I drove away from Rosedale with a broken heart and a mind forever scarred by what I had witnessed, a place where sorrow and spectral terror merged, leaving behind nothing but whispers of the lost. Now, as I recount this story in the safety of my home, I know that every sleepless night is a reminder of that haunted sojourn. Rosedale remains a scar on my memory, a place where the echoes of grief continue to call out to those unfortunate enough to wander its abandoned streets. I share my tale not as a work of fiction, but as a testament to an encounter with the inexplicable. Beware those roads that lead deep into the heart of nowhere. Sometimes, escape is merely an illusion. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I remember it all too clearly, every detail seared into my mind like a scar that refuses to fade. I'm sitting here now, speaking softly into the night, hoping that by sharing my true experience, you might find solace in knowing that you're not alone in the darkness. It was an ordinary autumn evening when I decided to take a detour along a barely marked road in the middle of nowhere. I was exhausted after long hours on the highway, seeking nothing more than a quiet place to sleep. But fate had something different planned for me. I pulled off the main road onto a gravel path that led deeper into the woods. The night was unusually silent. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, just a foreboding stillness that gnawed at my nerves. I parked my car near what appeared to be an abandoned farmhouse. It seemed like the only refuge for miles. Just a quick rest, I mumbled to myself, not knowing that this innocent decision would become a descent into terror. I stepped out of the car and stretched my limbs, trying to shake off the creeping chill that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its broken windows like empty eyes staring into my soul. I know it looks bad, but a little shelter is better than nothing, I reminded myself. Inside, the house was shrouded in darkness, and my footsteps echoed in the hollow silence as I made my way to the only room that seemed somewhat intact. A small parlor with a fireplace that still held the ghost of warmth from a long-dead fire. I settled down on a dusty armchair, wrapping myself in an old blanket I found. The atmosphere was thick with neglect and an indescribable heaviness that seemed to press on my chest. As I tried to find comfort, a soft creak from above made me freeze in place. Probably just the wind, I whispered, though my heart pounded like a drum in the silence. Minutes later, the creaks turned into distinct footsteps overhead. I could feel my skin prickle with a sense of dread. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no reply, only the steady sound of footsteps moving slowly, deliberately. I felt trapped like a moth caught in a flame. Deciding to confront whatever was upstairs, I crept to the staircase, each step eliciting another creak from the old wood. With my heart in my throat, I reached the top and found a long, dark corridor. A single door at the corridor's end caught my eye. The handle was cold to the touch, and as I reached out, the door creaked open on its own. I stepped inside into a room that was inexplicably cold, even for a night this chilly. There, scrawled on the dusty wall, were words that I couldn't have imagined. A frantic, almost illegible message that read, "You are not alone, we are always watching." I froze, the gravity of the situation overwhelming me. Who had written that? Was it a warning or a deranged delusion of a long-dead mind? I retreated back down the stairs, every instinct screaming to leave this nightmare behind. I returned to the parlor and locked myself in, clutching a rusted iron candlestick for a semblance of safety. Every sound echoed in my ears. Each gust of wind, every distant rustle became a harbinger of impending doom. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, that unseen eyes were tracking my every move. In the hours that followed, sleep eluded me. I sat in the parlor, fighting a relentless battle with my own terror. Every once in a while, the house would groan as if it were breathing, its ancient timbers resonating with a dreadful life of their own. I kept thinking back to local legends, stories of families that had perished in this very place, or perhaps souls trapped in an unending cycle of torment. The line between myth and grim reality began to blur until I couldn't distinguish the two. Then, just as I was about to resign to the terror of endless wakefulness, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible above the creaks of the old house. "Leave," it murmured, a plea that chilled me to the core. I stared at the darkness, my mind racing as if searching for the source of that desperate sound. The whisper grew louder, becoming almost a chorus of voices repeating in unison. "Leave now," they implored, as though they were trying to warn me away from some unspeakable fate. Desperation lent me the strength to make a run for it. I didn't even pack my belongings. I simply bolted for the door, into the cold night air and into the unknown. I never looked back, even as I heard the house's door slam behind me, as if in furious protest. I ran down the gravel path, my feet pounding against the ground in frantic rhythm with my pulsating heart. As I retraced my route back to the main highway, I couldn't shake the image of those desperate, ghostly whispers. In the silence of that endless road, every shadow seemed alive with menace. I kept glancing nervously over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the darkness. I recalled the room upstairs, the cryptic message on the wall, and the unyielding sense of being watched. Each memory fused together into a nightmare that I would never fully escape. Eventually, I made it back to civilization, but the experience left an indelible mark. I no longer find solace in sleep. The memory of those eerie voices and the feeling of unseen eyes watching me from the depths of night never leave me. Since then, I have shared my story with anyone who will listen, hoping that my encounter might serve as a stark warning. Sometimes the places we assume to be mere refuges hide dark secrets in their decaying walls. Every now and then, when I close my eyes, I revisit that silent farmhouse, reliving the terror of its ghostly inhabitants. The lines between reality and the paranormal blur each time, and the voices still call out in the dead of night. I continue to wonder who they were, what they wanted, and why fate chose me to be their audience. No amount of sleep, nor any attempted escape from that night, has managed to erase the horror etched into my soul. It remains a vivid testament to the fact that in the middle of nowhere, sometimes the true horror is not a figment of imagination, but a very real, malevolent presence that lingers long after the night has passed. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road, feeling the chill of isolation in the dead of night, remember my words. Trust the instincts that warn you of unseen dangers, for sometimes shelter among the ruins of forgotten structures may invite more than just exhaustion. It may beckon the very spirits of despair. And now, as I sit here under the dim glow of a solitary street lamp, I can't help but hear the faint echo of those whispers, as if the ghostly inhabitants of that forlorn farmhouse have followed me home, lingering in the shadows of my every thought. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I still remember the night it all began. The chill in the wind, carrying whispers I couldn't quite decipher. I had been driving through desolate backroads for hours when my car sputtered to a stop in the middle of nowhere. It was a place no one ever mentioned on maps, a long-forgotten stretch of country where reality and nightmare blurred. I parked on a gravel path that led to an old abandoned farmhouse. The eerie silence that engulfed the area was deafening, and I instinctively knew that I was about to witness something inexplicable. At first, I sought refuge in the decaying farmhouse, hoping to find a way to call for help. The door creaked open, as if it had been expecting me. Inside, the building groaned under the weight of years of neglect, with dust motes dancing in the weak beam of my flashlight. I remember thinking that I was alone, but as the hours ticked by, I began to hear subtle sounds. The soft padding of footsteps, distant murmurs, and the unmistakable snap of a twig underfoot. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant thud echoed in my heart like a sinister drumbeat. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind and my own frayed nerves. Yet, the uneasy sensation of being watched overpowered any rational explanation. I whispered to myself. There's nothing here but the ghosts of the past, though deep inside, I doubted my own words. As I settled in to wait out the night, a knock on the door startled me. I froze, hardly daring to breathe, wondering if the knock was real or just a trick of an overactive mind. Slowly, I approached the door and peered through the keyhole, only to be met with darkness. No human face was visible, yet the soft tapping continued. My heart pounded as I recalled old legends of this region, stories of vengeful spirits wandering the lonely roads, seeking redemption for tragedies long since buried under the weight of history. I knew these tales were dismissed by most as rural superstition, but now, faced with an unexplainable presence, every story rang disturbingly true. After several long minutes, the knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I sat in the dim glow of a battered lamp, my thoughts racing with memories of my childhood and the warnings my grandmother used to repeat. In these forsaken places, not all that sleeps is at peace, she had said. That night, those words echoed relentlessly in my ears. I felt an overwhelming force urging me to run, yet curiosity and terror intertwined, leaving me paralyzed in a state of conflicted dread. In the darkest hour before dawn, I began to hear what sounded like urgent whispers emanating from the walls. The murmurs grew steadily louder, as if an unseen congregation was gathering to share a dark secret. I mustered my courage and followed the sounds through narrow, winding corridors of the farmhouse. In one of the many abandoned rooms, I found scratches on the peeling wallpaper, a series of cryptic symbols and words etched in what appeared to be dried blood. The message was obscured, yet one line was chillingly clear: "We never truly leave this place." I clutched my chest, the weight of the message pressing down on me like a physical burden. Desperation set in as I fumbled for a phone, but the signal was nowhere to be found. I was trapped, left alone with the supernatural manifestations of a long-forgotten tragedy. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath was visible in the frigid air. A presence made itself known as I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. I spun around, half expecting to see a phantom, but there was nothing, only the relentless rustle of the wind through broken glass. I began to cry out for help, my voice hoarse and trembling, but my cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence of that forsaken place. There, in that hour of despair, the spirit revealed itself, not as a single entity, but as a legion of souls, whose tormented cries had been lost in time. Their voices mingled into a cacophony of despair and longing, recounting tales of betrayal, sorrow, and a desperate search for absolution. With each passing moment, I felt more entangled in their haunting world. The whispers turned into anguished wails, and the air vibrated with a sorrowful energy that penetrated every fiber of my being. I stumbled back towards the main hall, my steps frantic, every corner of that haunting structure now alive with the echoes of the past. In the reflection of a shattered mirror, I caught a glimpse of a face, a gaunt, sorrowful visage that seemed to be both pleading and condemning all at once. It was as if the countless tragedies of those who had died in this isolated stretch of land were crying out, seeking recognition. I begged silently for forgiveness or release, not knowing whether the spirits were capable of mercy or simply bound to the eternal cycle of their own torment. By the time the sun began to rise, the spectral activity had subsided, leaving me a shaken wreck. As I fumbled with the old lock to escape the clutches of the house, I could still hear soft echoes whispering, "Stay with us. Stay with us." The farmhouse's oppressive aura clung to me like a second skin as I made my way back to my car. Even as the early morning light broke through the darkness, a profound melancholy lingered, as if the souls of the forsaken had embedded themselves within my heart. That day, I drove away from the location, haunted by images of the spectral faces and the sorrowful laments that would not fade from memory. I realized that I had encountered something beyond simple explanation, something rooted in tragedy and despair that defied the passage of time. Since that night, the visions of those lost souls have occasionally returned in my dreams, and the soft voice of a long-forgotten spirit still calls out in the quiet solitude of night. I write this account not as a fable, but as a testament to the inexplicable powers that reside in the remote corners of our world. The farmhouse remains, a monument to the unresolved memories of the past, and I have learned that sometimes the horrors of the middle of nowhere are real and relentless. I hope that by sharing my story, those seeking solace in the safety of rationality may be reminded that our reality is more mysterious and fragile than we often dare to believe. I now understand that the cries for help are never truly silenced. They merely wait, echoing in the corridors of abandoned places until someone with a willing heart dares to listen. Even now, as I sit before you recounting the terror I endured, the night seems to draw near once more, and a faint chill brushes against my skin. The memory of that fateful night is seared into my soul, a constant reminder that there are places in our world where the past never dies, where lost souls wander in endless torment, and where a seemingly innocent stop along a forgotten road can become a gateway to realms beyond our control. I have learned to live with the shadows of that evening, forever alert to the whispers of the unseen and the quiet curses of the middle of nowhere. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper?